Next week there's going to be a forum on godly play. You might be aware that that's a religious education program that's being adopted here at the Cathedral for the youngsters. But it also has something to teach us as adults. I know in the fall we had a retreat where some of us were learning about how godly play works in an adult setting as well. So if you're interested in finding out about that, come next week. This morning I'm going to begin with a blessing from this book that I've used before, To Bless the Space Between Us, a book of blessings by John O'Donohue. And I'm going to use the prayer for a leader. Now this is one that the search committee has been using some for in our prayers as we look for a new dean. But it's equally applicable to this new leader that the Roman Church has, Pope Francis. For a leader, may you have the grace and wisdom to act kindly, learning to distinguish between what is personal and what is not. May you be hospitable to criticism. May you never put yourself at the center of things. May you act not from arrogance, but out of service. May you work on yourself, building up and refining the ways of your mind. May those who work for you know you see and respect them. May you learn to cultivate the art of presence in order to engage with those who meet you. When someone fails or disappoints you, may the graciousness with which you engage be their stairway to renewal and refinement. May you treasure the gifts of the mind through reading and creative thinking, so that you continue as a servant of the frontier, where the new will draw its enrichment from the old, and you never become a functionary. May you know the wisdom of deep listening, the healing of wholesome words, the encouragement of the appreciative gaze, the decorum of held dignity, the springtime edge of the bleak question. May you have a mind that loves frontiers, so that you can evoke the bright fields that lie beyond the view of the regular eye. May you have good friends to mirror your blind spots. May leadership be for you a true adventure of growth. Amen.
Amen.
If you would have said to me about a year ago that I would ever be doing a forum on one of the popes, I would have said, I don't think so. That's how things change. My first connection with this one is kind of unusual from the sense that, no, I'd never heard of him before that day that he was elected as pope. But that day, I was thinking, okay, they always have to choose a name that they haven't had before, perhaps. I thought, what name would be a good name to have this round? And I thought, Francis. So I was glad about that. And then when he came out, I thought, looks okay. And a couple days later, that I heard that he was the runner-up to Pope Benedict back in the last election in 2005 or whenever it was, and I thought, well, that can't be good. But he has surprised me, I think, most of the rest of the world. So that's what we're here to talk about. And as you know, this is kind of a big day in Rome. If you were listening to the news, you probably heard the bells ringing over there because they were having two new saints, John the 23rd and John Paul II. So there's lots of people there. So Papa Francesco, as they call him over there, he's fast becoming one of the world's best known and most loved figures, simply because of his disarming manner. There's certainly people in the world who are well known because they're royalty or because they're a leader of one of the nations, that kind of thing. But this one, I think people are attracted to him because he's not that kind of person necessarily. Practically every week he makes headlines by saying or doing something unexpected. Now, there are many things one would expect a pope to do, but this one often surprises us by venturing into uncharted waters. In this forum, I'm hoping to engage us in a conversation about what is so attractive about this man. And as an Episcopalian, why should it matter to us? You might think about what would he say if he came to visit us at this cathedral on Memorial Park? And what would we say to him? I've been an Episcopalian for more than 10 years, and I can tell you what this Pope means to me. I have lived as a Roman Catholic for more than 50 years. And what stands out in my memory is how much was never discussed. Issues that were and are important. So it was refreshing to find in St. Mark's and in the Episcopal Church in the United States a community of Christians and an institutional church that had worked through many of the issues of our time. As a result, many are able to live with a sense that we are learning to follow Jesus. Here it's not necessary to say this or that topic is off the table because of long tradition. Now, perhaps some of you became tired over the years of having people come to join you who were refugees, who had been damaged by the years of being told that only the hierarchy had a voice, and who needed to know that someone would listen in this safer environment. This Pope has a knack for taking a look at many of the things that can be discussed now. Indeed, they cry out for discussion. He did not set out in the first week of his papacy a list of issues that needed to be addressed. Some may have wished that he just followed in the ways of his most recent predecessor. However, as the title of the lengthy interview in America magazine last fall proclaimed, this man has a big heart open to God. So he slowly hinted at what he would take on as issues to be looked at. So in doing that, I think he is like Henry Nouwen. Have you ever read that book from quite a few years ago now called The Wounded Healer? Great Nouwen book. And that's to not unbandage all the wounds of the body of the church at once, but only one at a time. So I must say he does about one a week. He knew that the Vatican Bank had a sketchy history and recently instituted reform. Most remarkably, he now will champion those children and adults who have been abused by priests or nuns or anyone in the employ of the church. He did not say that it was a problem that others had created. From the first week, he put aside much of the pomp associated with the Vatican lifestyle by not moving into the papal suite and by setting an example for clergy and laity alike to live simply and be mindful of the poor. As you may have noticed, people in Germany, Atlanta, and Newark noticed when their bishops were building new mansions for them to live in and called them on it. Even the liturgies have changed, becoming shorter and less grandiose. Now we might wonder if these innovations were calculated to win back Catholics who had left the church or who were barely hanging on. Now, you may have seen statistics that show the number of former Catholics in this country is larger than any other denomination. The number of former Catholics is larger than any other denomination besides the Catholics that are still there. So there's a lot to work with. But my sense, this is not a public relations campaign, or we would have seen through it by now. Thankfully, this is not all about him. He's not playing games with anyone. And I think that much is on the table. Pope Francis carefully discerns what he does. He said, discernment is always done in the presence of the Lord, looking at the signs, listening to the things that happen, the feelings of the people, especially the poor. Perhaps the only issues that will not change are having only men as priests and the strong stance against abortion. Where might there be room for changes? Now, as you know, the Roman Church has a long tradition of celibacy being required of clergy. But that was not imposed fully for more than 1,000 years. If that changed, perhaps there would be more interest in the priesthood in the 21st century. You're probably aware Roman Catholics face a crisis of not being able to care for the needs of parishioners in places like my former diocese in Milan. Big and small churches in rural Minnesota are yoked into area faith communities where each priest might have 3 or 4 churches to relate to, simply because there are not enough priests. And this has been a problem for a long time. I thought it was nuts. You know, even when I was there, I didn't have that 3 or 4 to relate to. The lack of priests would be even more pronounced in some areas of the world. So what suffers? Pastoral care. Pope Francis seems committed to giving a voice to women in the church in a way that has long been denied, making up more than half the members of the worldwide church. Many have served their local parishes tirelessly or have joined religious congregations who have been at the forefront of education, health care, pastoral care, worship, and social justice. Even when the Vatican looked on them with suspicion, the women religious in the United States stood strong. Think what they could do now if given a stronger voice. As an Episcopalian, I wish that we had heard more about what is happening in our own tradition, whether it's the Anglican Communion, the Episcopal Church USA, or the Episcopal Church in Minnesota. We have bishops at each of those institutions, but we do not always hear much of what they are thinking. The Archbishop of Canterbury last made headlines for baptizing Prince George. All those church bodies have many staff members who are working to further the mission of a church and to support us as a local parish. And I know one could go online if you wanted to learn more about those sorts of things. And I remember when I was first here at St. Mark's, we used to get a diocesan paper so you knew what was going on from that fashion. I just think we need more communication. I'd be interested in what they have to say. Maybe I shouldn't have to go online to find it. And here at the cathedral, of course, we want to be more than just a local parish. We want to be a cathedral for the Holy Episcopal Church in Minnesota and the Twin Cities community. And I think there is good news, but it's not being publicized well. And maybe the Pope gets more attention simply because there's 1.2 billion Catholics in the world. Now, this might be a question that you've been wondering about. Are Catholics who fled sometimes in the last 50 years, and it's probably been about that long for some, likely to return if the Pope makes good on what he has undertaken? I doubt it. Here we have the blessing of being ministered to by women who are bishops, priests, and deacons. We hear their voice and benefit from their hard work to advance the reign of God. For those of us in the LGBT community, it is likely that it would be a long time before we would find a welcome like that we receive at the cathedral, or have the option of being married at a Catholic parish. I'm personally glad that we will never hear this Pope say that homosexuals are intrinsically disordered, which relegated us to a despised minority. Come in. Hi, Dorothy. You come at just the right time.
I couldn't make it any earlier.
No, you really have come at the right time. I want to take some time to hear what you've been thinking about the Pope as you've heard the stories about him in the last year. And even more than that, of the qualities that I've mentioned so far. I'm going to ask you, are there any of these qualities that you think would be desirable in our new dean? Because we're still in the search process, and it's about time we figured out what those qualities are. Okay. Stories about the Pope. Roger?
Well, two things. First of all, I'm pleased that Pope John the Good was sainted today by Pope Francis. So Pope John the 23rd was my most favorite pope forever, because I read lots about him, and he was kind of a normal character, although he still wrote on those Cadillacs in those days. But I think what Pope Francis has done is he's drawn even my attention more to what it means to live within the simplicity of the image of Christ, and to be courageously present in a curia that's, I think, still very lofty. I think the thing that impressed me was that he fired the German bishop. And when you fire a German, that can be a lot of problems. And he took it on, and good for him. And I also think that the thing that impressed me was his movement away from the papal palace and into his dormitory kind of environment, and that he's driving a Ford Focus instead of a Cadillac. And I know that they're all symbolic in my thinking of the place of his heart. He really, in my estimation, has a keen feeling for what it means to live in poverty, to live in tension, to live in conflict, to live on the fringe. And I think probably more so than the previous pope, he's really got a handle on that part of the human community.
Gregory?
It seems to me I heard him mention it was Pope Francis said, I don't know exactly how he put it, but something to the effect that he cannot judge people and what they do in the privacy of their home, something like that.
Well, on the way home from Brazil, he was quoted as saying, for one thing, that who am I to judge? When he's asked about gay people.
Oh, yeah. Well, for me, that was kind of a release, because I was brought up, in Catholic school. At the age of 8, we were taught not to have impure thoughts. Now, without any definition of that, I had to think of all of the, what are impure thoughts? In the process, I was having tons of it. And to this day, I tell you, I still have guilt from anything sexual has this tone of, is that impure? And I was just happy to hear him say that.
Thank you, Greg.
I think you asked what would it be like if Pope Francis were to come here today. I think he would be totally comfortable. I think that he would probably shake your hand if you wanted. He'd probably give you his blessing. And I think that I think he would have no problem whatsoever being with us. And secondly, I think Pope Francis is in tremendous change in the faith. Pope Francis is preaching the gospel by his own life. And he's putting churchianity, which I love, behind him. We don't need churchianity. That's not the gospel. And I think that's what it's doing.
Thank you. Susan?
I think it's very interesting how, I don't know exactly, I have 103 friends on Facebook, and I seem to get a post about Francis just about every day from one of my friends. And so I'm kind of following him. At first, I absolutely could not believe he was doing insane things. I really couldn't. And I kept going to Snopes.com to see if this was a made-up post. Or, so the last few months I gave up. But what I think is the most interesting about him is he's not really, at least in what I'm seeing that's being publicized, he doesn't seem to be taking on doctrine. He just seems to be spreading a message of greater acceptance and greater love. And I think that that's very interesting. I think that the question comes for me, what happens after this pope? Is he going to set everyone's hearts on fire, and there's going to be this continuation of the response that he's getting, but it'll be in their own hearts, or is it just a, this personality? And that's not so much about him as it is about sort of how we act. But you asked about our new dean, and I think a big thing that we're trying to do, or some of us think is a good idea, is to really take the governance and the leading by example into the parish and into the people, not just the council, and but into the people. And I'm making that parallel between, okay, it's great to have a great dean, and really we've had the most fantastic transitional spiritual leader who's sitting over there. But it's sort of like, what happens next, regardless of the new dean? Who are we as a people of Jesus? That's all I have to say.
Yeah, I think we're trying to be more grounded is what you're talking about, so that it would continue no matter what leadership changes are being. It's kind of surprising that this pope got elected if you consider that, there's whole bunches of cardinals. Some of them can't vote because they're too old, but the ones that were able to vote, almost all of them were appointed under Pope John Paul II, who was very conservative and was appointing people who thought like he did. So it seems to be the Holy Spirit at work, and we've got something fresh coming out right now. Other thoughts about stories you know about this Pope or interests in our new dean?
Well, I just want to make a comment that we don't know what will happen after Francis. We didn't know what would happen after John the 23rd. Actually, we didn't know what would happen with John the 23rd. But great things happened. But the whole Curia is set up with a bunch of different congregations. They're all woven together like knitting. And it could unravel very fast after Pope Francis dies or steps down, whatever. So just as it did with John the 23rd, it started to revert almost immediately.
That could happen.
But if it's of God, it will last, and if it isn't, it won't last.
Amen, sister.
Last week I went to visit one of the two people that I visit for communion calls, and one of them said to me, I pray for this Pope every day, that he'll have time. He's only had a year so far, and he's 77 now, so that doesn't mean that he has a lot of time, but he doesn't waste it, that's for sure. Other thoughts about popes or qualities that we're looking for in our new dean? Yes.
Well, it certainly is opening the door in the Catholic Church with sacraments of baptism and communion to those who have been disfranchised in the past. I think we all know of cases where they wouldn't baptize because it was they hadn't been going to the church and wanted to do all those steps, and were communion not given to those who did not have number and had remarried. And I think it's just changing.
Thank you, Marge. Austin?
Yeah, regarding the sacraments, and perhaps you all read it. In this I read in the papers, but we know who knows the rest. But supposedly, Roman Catholics who divorced cannot remarry unless they've been annulled. Pope John supposedly, on the telephone, has this woman friend in his native country, and she's in that situation of being divorced, and he is saying that the Pope said, "You're okay, don't worry about it, you're not living in sin." I mean, that's revolutionary for the Pope to say anything like that. He's a revolutionary. I don't think they had the slightest idea what they were going to do when they got.
Roger?
One thing that I can appreciate as we make a bridge between Pope Francis and the new dean is that he seems to be depopifying the office of the papacy, where it isn't just who is in that office or what kind of global profile he might represent. And obviously he does have a large global profile because of what he's doing. But what he is doing is he's making this, he's demystifying this and saying, this is my responsibility as pastoral care for the 2.1 billion Catholics there are through the process of the church. And I really appreciated the word that he said about churchiology or churchianity. I never heard that term before, but I think it's a great term. I think that the Pope is sort of de-churchifying. And I think that the dean, when he comes, perhaps needs to be in the same venue and say, okay, I'm not moving into a position where the personality or the character of this institution is what is important, but that's through my presence here, I can guide the church into a greater global mission. I think the thing that's really impressed me with Bishop Bruce is that he's always talking about baptismal theology, the baptismal grace, and that we are all, as baptized members, priests of the church. And I'm not sure that I always got that message from the Pope or from the deans or from anybody from that area. But I think that that's where the church needs to be. We need to repossess the priesthood of all believers and make that the mission of the church, so that the Christ that we uphold becomes the greater image, and not the office, not the person in that office, or even the dogma and doctrine that the church that prevails in the church.
Thank you. Carol?
One of the things that I have appreciated is his relationship to children. And that's part of our future, establishing that relationship. Now, he's not sent, during Sunday schools or anything like that. But I think children will not be free from,
She will hear that. She said she was pointing to the Pope's relationship with children, how good that is. I'm going to go on a little more, and then we can continue with our discussion about him. On numerous occasions, he's defined himself as a sinner, and he also has complained that the media paint him as a superhero, which he finds offensive. So I think that's a really healthy dose of humility to know that how he understands himself and how he could be painted by the media could be dangerous for him. These are a few quotes from that long interview he had last fall that was published in America magazine. He says, "This church with which we should be thinking is the home of all, not a small chapel that can hold only a small group of selected people. We must not reduce the bosom of the universal church to a nest, protecting our mediocrity." And as you've probably heard, he sees the church as a field hospital after battle. No doubt he's noticed how many of those wounds were inflicted by the church in the past. And to continue that military analogy, I'm certain that Papa Francesco would like to see more of us in the trenches. Now this is a key point. It's kind of what Roger was talking about. On the primacy of conscience, he said religion has the right to express its opinion in the service of the people, but God in creation has set us free. It is not possible to interfere spiritually in the life of a person. What do you think about that? Now, as a former Roman priest, there was a time when I worked for the diocesan tribunal a little bit, and that's the body that works on annulments for people who've been divorced. And I could say some positive things about that, and I could say some things that are hard about it. One of them was reading the stories of what the people had actually gone through with their divorces. But one of the things that rarely came up, and that there's been a few times since I left that I've been asked to talk to some people in the Twin Cities about this, is that primacy of conscience. Dorothy's nodding over here, she knows this, that one of the things that they don't talk a whole lot about in the Roman Church is that, yes, you have primacy of conscience, and the Church has rules about this and about that, and sometimes that's good, sometimes it's healing. Maybe on the moment it could be healing for people, I recognize that. But there are times when you have to deal with the people, kind of like Foster was saying, about the Pope dealing with this woman and man in Argentina about their marital status. Deal with it individually and see what you can do that's not going to interfere in their life spiritually.
That was one of the things in the tool that came out, the primacy of conscience.
Okay, on preaching. A beautiful homily, a genuine sermon, must begin with the first proclamation, with the proclamation of salvation. Then you have to do catechesis. Then you can draw even a moral consequence. But the proclamation of the saving love of God comes before moral and religious imperatives. On ecumenism, we must walk united with our differences. There is no other way to become one. Now that's true. This is the way of Jesus. On women, we have to work harder to develop a profound theology of the woman. The feminine genius is needed wherever we make important decisions. On social justice, how I would like a church which is poor and for the poor. Inequality eventually engenders a violence which recourse to arms cannot and never will be able to resolve. How do you know if you're on the right track, if you're discerning correctly? He says, profound peace, and this is good for the search committee, profound peace, spiritual consolation, love of God and love of all things in God. This is the sign you are on the right path. On how our understanding of what it means to be human changes over time. And I think this is important too. This is really refreshing. The view of the church's teaching as a monolith to defend without nuance or different understandings is wrong. The thinking of the church must recover genius and better understand how human beings understand themselves today in order to develop and deepen the church's teaching. So things have changed in the last 2,000 years. Really, just the idea that you can understand humanity in a different way because we understand ourselves in a different way. And on prayer. His prayer is full of memory. He asks himself, what have I done for Christ? What am I doing for Christ? What should I do for Christ? He takes heart that the Lord remembers him even when Francis forgets about it. I don't know if you've seen this cover of the New Yorker from the last issue in 2013. The Pope making a snow angel. I thought it was lovely. I saw this when I was visiting one of the guys I take communion to, and the next month when I went back, I said, "Do you still have that picture?" And he went out to the garage and gave it to me. And then I read this story, this profile that was written by James Carroll. It's very good if you have not seen it. I'm just going to say a couple of things from that. And if you remember, if you happen to be here when I preached on the second Sunday of Lent, I had talked about James Carroll, the author of this, who was a former Roman priest, and he had written extensively about sacred violence in his books, Constantine's Sword and Jerusalem, Jerusalem. Now the article in here is titled, Who Am I to Judge? A Radical Pope's First Year. Now James says that he doesn't know that he's a liberal, but he thinks he's a radical. And James Carroll said that he was one of the people, like many of us, who never stopped being a Pope John the 23rd Catholic. And this is something that James says. The Pope unilaterally declared a kind of truce in the culture wars that had divided the Vatican and much of the world. Repeatedly, he argued that the Church's purpose was more to proclaim God's love for all people. than to condemn sinners for having fallen short of strictures, especially those having to do with gender and sexual orientation. For Francis, the Church's purpose is not to bring God to the world, but simply to emphasize God's presence already there. That's all I'm going to say, so I'm hoping to hear more from you. You have a few minutes if you'd like. I'll go around, so keep your hands. I will get to all of you. Anne?
One of the things in thinking about the new dean, and I just want to point out, Roger said the new dean, when he comes, we don't know that it's going to be a man. I'm assuming we don't know it's going to be.
I apologize to you for that.
But, and I also noticed when people are giving their homilies, and they quote an author or someone else, almost without fail, it's male. It's a male person who's quoted. It's rare that we quote a woman. It's rare that we quote someone of color. It's rare that we quote someone who's an LGBTQ person. It's rare. So my hope is, because Francis is talking about women, and having women be more involved, but he's certainly not talking about women becoming priests. And I hope that whomever the new dean is, she or he, and the rest of people who serve up in the pulpit will really acknowledge that women have a lot to say and offer, and you need to be saying it for them as well. And I'm not just saying you, Michael, but I'm and John and Roger's role. But it's really quite outstanding how little women are referenced.
John?
Well, I was tantalized by the idea that Pope Francis has